Thank you, Dean Smith. I want to thank Bridgemont for inviting me here today. I will say that Jeannie, or Dean Smith, talked me into this by offering me a pepperoni roll when it was all over with. So that shows you how easily I can be talked into something, I guess. But we wrestled a great deal with today's topic. How would we blend coal mine history into constitutional history? And might be a bit of a stretch, but in some ways probably not. And I think you'll find out some things about the coal fields today that you may or may not have known, or at least were only suspicious about. But to do so, we have to look at the Constitution itself, or in particular, the passage of the 18th Amendment. And I'm going to open with, if I can operate this thing, watch me get it messed up. I want to open with something that some of you may be aware of, but this is Elias and Troy Hat. Now, how far can I get from this thing? Can you still hear me if I'm here? All right. Let me stay this way. This is Elias and Troy Hatfield, of course, of the famous Hatfield-McCoy feud in the southern part of the state. So your immediate reaction would be, well, what's that have to do with liquor? Well, and the 18th Amendment. Well, some of you may know that Troy and Elias Hatfield were killed right over here at Harewood in 1911. Shortly before West Virginia had a prohibition movement. And they were killed because there was a disagreement about liquor territory. I remember the title, Criminals Are Whiskey Made. There are a variety of versions of the story, but what it boils down to is when they challenged the Italian Octavio Jerome about his selling liquor for his employer in a given area, a gunfight ensued within the homes of one of the Italian immigrants in that area of Harewood, and all three individuals were killed. This is a case where there's gunplay and everybody dies. And of course, that was Elias and Troy Hatfield. Additionally, not very far from where you're sitting right now, in 1904, the only Fayette County sheriff to have been killed in the line of duty was killed by some drunken coal miners here in Montgomery as a result of a disagreement over something that happened with a policeman the day before, and so forth. And in both cases, liquor is at play in one way or another, which is how we're going to get to the coal fields being somewhat instructive or supportive of the 18th Amendment. And we're going to look at examples of that. So in both of these cases, Sheriff Nehemiah Daniel, his killing, and the killing of Elias and Troy Hatfield and Octavio Jerome were related to liquor, whether it be sales or the consumption of liquor. For those people who drafted the United States Constitution, there can be little doubt that adding a prohibition clause never crossed their mind, because that would have seemed unacceptable to them. For that matter, George Washington, who, although he did not take an active role in the actual writing of the Constitution, he did preside over the assembly, but George Washington depended on his yearly income depended on his distilling operation. And there were others within the constitutional framers that did so as well. Moreover, if the topic had arisen within the Constitutional Convention, it's probably certain that most of the framers of the Constitution would have thought this was a violation of individual liberty. Someone wants to drink, then that's their business. Actually, the successful movement for a prohibition amendment in the United States Constitution evolved from the influences of America and America's changes that occurred after the Civil War. America soon became a completely different nation. In that, I mean, the changes centered on the evolution of an industrial economy, an economy that was much different than the economy that had existed before the Civil War. There's the corresponding growth of cities. There's a corresponding growth of an urban population. In particular, to some degree, even before the Civil War, women's groups incorporated their anti-alcohol campaign into other causes, such as suffrage for females and overall social reform. By the turn of the 20th century, the progressive movement produced an atmosphere that was more open to social reform. And that's what progressivism was about. It was a backlash of sorts against the many ills that were created by the expansion of industry. It was a backlash against the increasing power of corporations in the American system. Political corruption had expanded greatly from the Grant administration after the Civil War well into the early 1900s. And all this was associated with this change in America of an urban setting, of factory life, and in particular, the arrival of new immigrants. New immigrants referred to immigrants that now came by the 1880s and 1890s and early 1900s. They came from Eastern and Southern Europe. They tended to be Catholic. They tended to drink more. It was much more part of their social system. And these new immigrants, as they were called, who were not WASPs, white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant, caused a lot of folks to be concerned about what was happening to American society. In many ways, especially for these new immigrants, saloons in cities served as a form of social clubs. But groups who were opposed to drinking, especially women's groups at the time, held the premise that the saloon served as a home for political bosses, where they could influence individuals who were drinking. Saloons were a breeding ground of political corruption. Reformers argued that if you ended the sale of liquor, then that would take a step on this road to reform, social reform. Most reformers believed that liquor caused workers to squander their wages and neglect their families. Now, let's see if I got these in order. I always get these mixed up, so bear with me if I sound like I said. Now I can't get it to go back. There we go. And you notice how many of the female groups approach this liquor problem. This was very popular at the time. You would see this slogan everywhere. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. And so the women are using their feminine wiles, if you wish to say, to try to convince men to stop drinking. Some women, such as Carrie Nation, were much more militant. That hatchet that she's holding in her hand was a demonstration that she was ready to bust up all the kegs of liquor that were in the United States. And as I say, most folks at the time, watch me mess this up again. I keep hitting the wrong one. What they were seeing, what these social reformers were seeing at the time, was these type of living conditions, especially among the new immigrants who had come into America. Now, they're not particularly questioning the wages that these folks are making, which is the real problem, but they're saying the reason for this type of living condition is because, or at least a large part of it, is because of drinking. This line of reasoning viewed prohibition as a weapon that could stamp out poverty. If you stop drinking, then you will stamp out poverty in the United States. I think I'm scared to hit it again. I made it this time. These are some of the advertisements at the time. You can see the poor man's club. Remember I said stamp out poverty, the poor man's club? Well, he's paying his dues. And at home, you probably can't read the caption, but you see this destitute wife, small child in the high chair. They're in the condition they are in because this individual spends what little he makes in the local saloon. And of course, violence. The argument is that violence toward women is associated with drinking, with the consumption of liquor. Oddly enough, it's World War I that actually supplies an opportunity for such groups as the Anti-Saloon League, which was a particularly active group, the Young Women's Christian Association. Because of World War I, they gained a larger audience, for one thing, and they got patriotic reasoning to support their goals. Young men were preparing for war in 1917. Keep in mind, the United States does not enter World War I until 1917, even though the war begins in 1914. Women's associations conducted lectures across the country at the time, and they warned young women against the hazards of illicit love. That's where the lecture starts. They're telling these women they referred often to a higher standard of personal conduct and civil cleanliness. The Young Women's Christian Association distributed their slogan, which was, "Do your bit to keep him fit." Don't get him involved in illicit love. I should add that this is 1917, 1918 is when there is the first start of a rise in illegitimate pregnancy in the United States, which has more to do with the automobile than anything else. But these folks are associating it with, of course, drinking. The idea is to morally uplift. That was the major theme. You're going to morally uplift people by stopping drinking, cleanliness in all forms of life, of their life. And once again, World War I helps make this possible. Prohibitionists always had relied on a variety of medical, moral, and social arguments. But the war provided them with the final ammunition they needed. Because, and this is rather odd, folks don't think about this often, but during World War I, it was pointed out, many manufacturers of beer required barley. And so temperance became a means of food conservation. You had to produce food for troops who are going overseas. You had to produce food for the war effort. And they're going to use up barley to make beer, is the argument. And since many brewers were German Americans, then temperance or prohibition could be equated with Americanism. After all, that's the Germans. They'll use that to weaken us, was the argument. Additionally, drunkenness lowered the efficiency of defense workers, was the argument. And so that limits the potential fighting ability of soldiers. Therefore, temperance achieved the status of a patriotic necessity. One reformer insisted that liquor manufacturers would make drunkards of the entire army and leave American defenseless. Just for my curiosity and more of a sidelight, when the American troops arrived in France, the French minister was quite surprised and shocked that the American army did not supply something that the French always provided for their soldiers. Now, I know what your first answer is going to be. You're going to say, well, it must be liquor, but it's not. Any idea what that was? What? Wine. Oh, that's a good guess, actually. You'd never get it. Actually, prostitutes. Now, remember, they've gone through this entire... and when it was agreed that the French would supply prostitutes for the American army, then someone said, don't let Wilson know, President Wilson, or he'll shut down the whole damn war. But it's all about this whole idea of cleanliness in America, but a lot of other moral cleanliness is driving reform. Federal prohibition moved forward in May of 1917 when the U.S. Army forbid liquor sales around military camps. Then in December of 1917, Congress got on the bandwagon and they reduced the legal content of beer and passed the 18th Amendment. Now, even though states did not ratify the amendment until 1919, the congressional passage of the bill encouraged members of the Anti-Saloon League in particular to suggest that World War I might lead to worldwide prohibition. They genuinely believed that this was the first step, and pretty soon there would be no drinking. The entire human race would be teetotalers. A fat chance of that happening, right? But they believed it. Prohibitionists insisted that passage of the amendment would eradicate poverty. That was their argument. Poverty will be gone if you get rid of liquor. It will improve conditions for the working class. Additionally, and this gets toward our area here for today, the reformers also promised a reduction in crime because the quote, which is what the quote you saw coming up, the actual quote was, 90% of adult crimes are whiskey made. In other words, 90% of the folks particularly who are guilty of committing felonies were intoxicated at some level. So the overall goal of the Anti-Saloon League and other groups was it's centered on improving the nation's physical health and the nation's moral fiber. Here's the catch. That is morality as they saw it and they defined it. Obviously, not all Americans supported prohibition. The supporters versus the opponents tended to follow religious lines, ethnic lines, geographic lines. Prohibitionists tended to be Baptists or Methodists. They also tended to be old stock Americans, meaning not part of the new immigration coming in. Anti-prohibitionists, those opposed to it, tended to be Catholics, Jews, Lutherans, and first or second generation new immigrants. Prohibitionists also generally came from small towns in the South or the Midwest. But people who lived in the cities tended to oppose prohibition. Now, I kind of skipped over something here that I should have reminded you of. Keep in mind, the Prohibition Amendment did not prohibit the consumption of intoxicating beverages. What it did was it prohibited the sale and the manufacture of spirits. Eventually, they defined it as anything above 0.5% of alcohol content is illegal to be sold or manufactured. But this meant that those who could afford to do so managed to store up an adequate supply of liquor before the amendment went into effect, which means that people such as J.P. Morgan, the great financier at the time, Andrew Carnegie, or a John Rockefeller, they would not have their social gatherings limited by the Prohibition Amendment because they stored up a stock of this. They're not going to sell it. They're not manufacturing it. They store up this stock before the amendment goes into effect. Okay, now, I had to set that in place. How do the West Virginia coal camps fit into all this? First off, consider the fact that the West Virginia Prohibition Law preceded the federal constitutional amendment. In other words, there is a West Virginia constitutional prohibition amendment before there is a U.S. Constitution amendment. And West Virginia is not alone. It happens in some other states across the nation. Had it not have happened, the U.S. could have never passed a prohibition amendment in 1917 and then ratified it in 1919. But the states take the lead on this. West Virginia passed, I'm not sure I gave you the date, they passed their constitutional amendment in 1912. So that's several years before the federal amendment. And one of the reasons it was successful in West Virginia is by the late 19th century, public education in West Virginia had been successful in convincing many youngsters of the dangers of alcohol and narcotics. And those students would become crusaders in a prohibition movement. Now, I mentioned narcotics. There was a narcotic that was quite common in by the 1890s and certainly into 1910, 1911, 1912. Here in West Virginia, you can purchase it from peddlers. You can purchase it from the drugstore, but you didn't have to. It cost more there. Get it from a peddler. You can buy it off someone on the street. What narcotic do you think that might have been? What was that? You're on the right track. I think it'll surprise you. Cocaine, yes. And the reason I mention is how surprised I was in the original research about violence in coal camps when I found out so many folks were addicted to cocaine in 1899. And so there had been a campaign in West Virginia against drinking, against cocaine, and it had been successful. And so this generation that comes along tends to champion the prohibition movement as they get older. Generally, the population in West Virginia, those who favored prohibition tended to come from the older, settled areas of West Virginia. The examples of the saloon in the industrializing area that people talked about at the time. They said, this is the problem. Look here in West Virginia, where we have our trouble is the industrializing areas and the saloons in those areas. And that tended to drive, the truth of that matter tended to drive those who were sitting on the fence into the prohibition camp, which is again where the coal camps are going to come into play. It's here, in these early coal camps, that the perfect example is provided for the dangers of the saloon and drinking. In the late 19th, early 20th century, the new coal camps, the frontier coal camps in West Virginia, demonstrate the social dangers of drinking. They demonstrate the problems associated with liquor consumption and the associated easy access to firearms. In other words, they're going to have a role. What happens in these early coal camps is going to have a role in convincing West Virginians to not only pass a state prohibition amendment, but to be highly supportive of a federal prohibition amendment. Okay. I want to ask you, again, an unusual question, although you know where I'm headed here. Thinking of American history in general, if you were going to think of a town or a place that, again, the famous part of U.S. history, where you might get gunned down in a saloon, what place comes to mind? Where? Dodge City, absolutely. Deadwood, South Dakota. I think I heard Deadwood. Here's the reality. And those places were brutal. Don't get me wrong. Actually, in the mid-1890s and the very early, certainly the first decade of the 1900s, a southern West Virginia coal miner who frequented saloons and holiday celebrations had more chance of being gunned down along the rugged camps of New River, camps such as Rush Run, Slater, Beechwood. Some of you are probably familiar. You've heard folks talk about them at some point. They had more chance of being gunned down there than a cowhand did in Dodge City. These early camps, I'll get it wrong again, I know. Eventually, by the end of this, I'll hit the right one. Okay. The camps I'm talking about, if you're familiar with the New River area, are, I think of Quinwood, Quinnamont, McKendree, Stone Cliff especially. You want to get gunned down, Stone Cliff's a good place for it to happen, especially Rush Run. And today I'm going to add probably, slipping over the line a little bit, some areas along Cabin Creek, because there's some good examples there, and certainly up on Paint Creek. If you're familiar, if you think of Oak Hill and you go outside of Oak Hill, Scarborough, the saloons there, these are violent places. Now here's the catch, so to speak. Did I get it right? Whoa, Betsy. No. Okay. When folks think of coal camps today, they tend to think of this. A mature coal camp. There's a big difference in what we're referring to. We're talking about the very early coal camps. The coal camps that would match the setting of Deadwood, South Dakota, for example, when gold is discovered and it springs up. This is later. You cannot apply what I'm about to say to those frontier coal camps. Now, again, this probably looks familiar to a lot of folks. It doesn't matter which one of those I push. It always goes back. I've noticed that. I got them mixed up. I may have a PhD, but I'm not smart enough to operate this thing. This is a coal camp. This is the early frontier-style coal camps, and that's the key word, frontier. These camps along New River, and in particular, are frontier settings. This is what's called a miner shanty. There will be 4 or 5 miners in one of these compartments. This is taken a little later in miner shanties, but when families have arrived. But this is what a miner could expect. Miner shanties along close to the mine site itself. And most folks, when they see this old photograph, they immediately say this is a lumber camp. It is not a lumber camp. It is a coal camp unfortunately not in Fayette County, but it's symbolic of what happens in Fayette County. That's actually down near Goodwill in Wyoming County. But even out west, cow towns were not the most violent places. Dodge City, yes. Mining towns out west were the most dangerous. You're more likely to get gunned down in Deadwood or Deadwood, South Dakota, Bodie, California, than you will in Dodge City. Mining towns out there are the most dangerous, and the mining towns here in West Virginia, the early coal camps, are highly dangerous. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to give you the FBI index. The FBI index relates to homicides per 100,000 population. All right. Dodge City, in its heyday, it had a rate that was higher than the cities back on the East Coast at the time. The rate was high. In Dodge City, the rate was 50. That means 50 people killed for every 100,000 in population. But remember what I said, mining camps versus cow towns. The mining camp of Bodie, California, had 116 homicides per 100,000. So it's more than double Dodge City. My figures at this point are still a work in progress. But what seems to be coming to the forefront right now as I try to crunch all these numbers is, now the map's gone and I'll never find it again. Again, I'm going to assume that some of you have some working knowledge of the New River area. Between the area of Stone Cliff, which is just above Thurman, if you know anything about rafting, you're familiar with Thurman and so forth, just above Thurman, up to Quinnamont on New River. So you get up near Prince, past Thayer in that area. What I'm seeing at this point is an FBI index of 128 per 100,000. So that's 128 miners being gunned down in saloons, outside the saloons, and so forth, when you compare that with 50 per 100,000 in Dodge City. But again, the overall point is we're talking about the frontier setting. You can't transfer this to the more mature coal camps. The people who come into the coal camps in the early stages are rugged folks. It's just, man. This is a boarding house. Now, oftentimes folks who have been drinking quite a bit, they come back to the boarding house and you'll have incidents. There was one close by here on Turkey Creek. Turkey Creek was just outside at that time period in 1898, 1899, was just outside of Mount Hope. Miners got in an argument over a pair of shoes. They've both been drinking a little bit. The other one shoots, one invites the other one to go out into the front lawn to settle this thing. And the other one just shoots him in the back. He went out. They've both been drinking some, and most folks out west and in the coal camps are gunned down unarmed, or they're shot in the back, or in some cases they shoot themselves. Keep in mind, most cowboys even, who were wounded, shot themselves. They weren't shot by other individuals. The rise of crime in Fayette County in particular becomes evident as the coal industry springs up throughout the New River Valley and up into and around the area of Oak Hill and so forth. Now, I think I've got everything messed up again. If you look at these folks, they look like a rough set of customers. They are. These are individuals who live by a code of self-reliance. They have an attraction for weapons. They learn how to get pretty good with them rather quickly. Okay. See if I can get... This is the type of entertainment that was quite common at the time. Cat and dog fight in Glen Jean. These went on all the time. And if you notice, fight had been extensively advertised. It was. I checked the newspaper. It was even advertised in the newspaper. I found handbills. And it wasn't the first fight. It was a violent situation. Whiskey flowed freely. Guns galore were in evidence. All was peaceful until after the contest, when the melee commenced. One white man was shot through the arm. A score of others had mashed noses and broken heads. The violence of the cat-dog fight. Now, these are vicious dogs and wildcats. They're not, they're not tabby. They're not the house cat. It's the type of entertainment that drives these folks. And these folks live in a violent world as well. Working underground was rather violent. But I'm not going to get there. Again, this is working in the late 19th, early 20th century. It's a violent world. Blasting, injuries are common. You have to be self-reliant underground. They are self-reliant, proud, honorable on the surface. This is all too common in the coal fields. Now, I don't know if this individual, based on what I can find out this far, he wasn't gunned down, but was actually killed in the mines, but I'm not even sure about that. Okay, this is what I was after. You have to have some hardcore numbers if you're going to argue something. I can give you a variety of stories, but here's the actual figures of number of miners that are killed. 1886, one miner every 148. That's per year. So your odds over 20 years or 10 years or something are not too good. It varies a little bit from year to year. So they work in a physically dangerous world. All right. These are the figures that represent the rise in crime itself. There's a rise in number of people dying in the mines, but there's a rise in number of people being gunned down on the surface. There's a lot of violent confrontations that go with this increase in population. 1904, the warden of the state penitentiary, which was at the time C.E. Haddix, he pointed out that the five counties of Fayette, McDowell, Mercer, Kanawha, Mingo, all developing coal counties, they had a combined population, do I have it up there? I don't. They had a combined population of 139,812 individuals. All right, that's the population of those five counties. But they contributed 419 of the 748 state convicts. There was a comparative list of agricultural counties that were close by with a population of 205,000 plus a few more. And they sent only 28 criminals to the penitentiary. And these tend to be felons. Most folks for misdemeanors didn't go to state penitentiary. They were incarcerated in local jails and served on chain gangs and so forth. In an effort to identify the cause of the disparity between the two counties, or between these two figures of agricultural counties versus mining counties, the warden started pointing to drinking. And one of the things they discovered at Moundsville rather quickly, miners would come there to Moundsville. They'd serve out their time. All right, they would give them money to buy their train ticket, and it was a long trip to get back to Fayette County at that time. Buy their train ticket back to Fayette County. But what they discovered was the first thing that these guys would do when they got out of the prison was to go down to the saloons in Moundsville, spend up all their money to drink, and start irritating all the people in the neighborhood begging for money to try to get their train ticket to get back to Fayette County. And so the prison actually, these folks are so committed to drinking that the prison eventually has to provide them a railroad pass because they're going to spend the money. Otherwise, they're just going to aggravate everybody to death. Most importantly, by 1906, the warden's records indicated that murder or similar incidents of violence represented 80% of the crimes in Fayette County and McDowell County in particular. In 1880, this is before mining really takes off, only 3 of 229 convicts at the Moundsville State Prison were from Fayette County. Only 3. But by 1905, the number had increased to 130. And the number did not represent the increase in population. The percentage is way above that. And most of these crimes are violent crimes. 80% violent crimes. And most of it springing out of saloons and so forth. And again, drinking at holiday celebrations. Quite simply, folks talk about Mate 1 and what happened at Mate 1 in the Cold Wars. And of course, the Hatfield-McCoy feud in Mingo County and so forth. The reality is that was a Sunday school picnic compared to Fayette County between 1890 and certainly 1895 to 1910. In fact, the newspaper mentioned the fact that a term of court coming up had 19 murder cases on the docket. 19 murder cases. That's more than you have now. And the paper said, now excuse me, the average was 19. I apologize. 27 murder cases on the docket, and said a high number even for Fayette County. Even for Fayette County? And all of it stems back to drinking. Much of it stems back to drinking, I guess I should say. Even coal trains were stopped. Supply trains were stopped and sidetracked so that liquor trains could get through. That's one of the first things officials noticed when they came in the area. So they get sidetracked so that another train gets the right of way, and they say, well, what's on the train? Liquor. Because the operators wanted to make certain that miners had liquor on a regular basis and they wouldn't binge quite as much. That was the idea. Gunplay is quite common in the saloons. One will not find incidents where folks sort of follow the Hollywood version of people walk out in the street, they're arguing, and they're going to draw their weapons and fire. It actually did happen near us at one point, and that was a rush run. Two coal miners drinking got in an argument. They agreed to meet the next morning. They walked out in what passed for Main Street and rush run, drew their weapons and fired at each other, and one killed the other one. So you can't find cases of it. But these individuals are a hard-bitten lot. They are single men on the spree. It's illegal to carry weapons at the time, including billy clubs, steel knuckles, dirks as they're called, knives of a particular length, and of course pistols. And lots of folks get fined for it. And it seemed to surprise many of the older Appalachian historians or senior Appalachian historians when I demonstrated that even coal company officials were fined for carrying pistols. There is a tendency to look at what happens in the coal camps in the context of labor strikes. But there's a much longer period there where both sides are being taken to jail over these things. Young American males held an attraction for weapons. And those seeking economic opportunity who come into the southern coal fields, they're not only going to drink, they've got a fascination with guns. They read dime novels that glorify what's going on out west. And it leads to their behavior to some extent. I've completely forgotten where I'm at here. This is a saloon that was not too far from where you're at now. Even though it looks it's probably run down even more at this point, I wouldn't go in a place like that on a dare. I mean, look at it, for heaven's sakes. It just looks dangerous. Actually, this is the Red Rabbit Saloon. Red Rabbit was a very common name. It was a name that seemed popular among folks who want to name saloons. And this is at Carbon. I can easily point out a death not only here or a shooting here, 2 here. The Red Rabbit Saloon in Scarborough, 3 in a year and a half. That's just the shootings themselves. That doesn't count the ones where they went outside and settled it. Individuals, I'm running out of time here. Let me finish it. Let me give you a couple examples. The women get in on the act as well. Italian women, I don't have anything specific to that. Probably seen this. This is a saloon outside of Oak Hill. Quite popular. One of the better saloons built by co-operators. Make sure they get the liquor they need. Pool rooms were sometimes served liquor, but oftentimes not. There were incidents that arose in the pool rooms. But as I said, the women got in on the act too. Prostitutes took advantage of drunken coal miners. They get them drunk. They know it's payday. They steal their pay. In fact, in one case, they tried to drug one coal miner in Fayette County. The problem was they gave him too much narcotic and he died. And so he ended up in prison. But women, Italian women in particular, seem to have a preference for shotguns. They get tired of a husband coming home drunk and being boisterous, and so they would blow them away with a shotgun. Happened right over here again at Boomer, not Smithers itself. but the women are drinking, and sometimes there were domestic issues where one here in Fayette County where the wife was habitually intoxicated, her coal miner husband was habitually intoxicated, and so in one of these bouts of intoxication, he actually cut her throat with a razor. But to put these ruffians even a little more in context, I'm going to use an incident that occurred. If you're familiar with the area, you're familiar with the New River Park headquarters, National River headquarters in Glen Jean. About 1 mile from Glen Jean was a place called Dairy Hill. If you drive through there today on the old route over to Mount Hope, you'll see it says Dairy Hill Loop or Dairy Hill Road. I can't remember. There's not much of anything left there. But some miners on payday Saturday, and that's usually when the trouble sprang up, they went to the saloon at Dairy Hill. One of these 3 miners, who was named McCoy, and bragged about the fact that folks needed to leave him alone because he was from the McCoy family in southern part of the state, and letting everyone know that he was dangerous. Well, they're all drinking, and during the course of the evening, someone shows up at the constable's, Justice of the Peace office. This is in the era when there were you had a Justice of the Peace and a constable served as the enforcement officer. They go down to the JP, they tell him someone's dead up there at the Dairy Hill Saloon. And they think it's the bartender, the bar owner. But they're not sure. The JP can't find the constable, so he walks up to the saloon about that mile, and he goes in. Everybody's drinking, having a good time. He doesn't see anything going on. So he asks the McCoy, who's behind the bar, is there someone dead here? And McCoy says, not that I know of. And so the JP moves around a little bit, and he comes back to McCoy again. He said, well, I heard someone was dead here. Where's the individual who, I don't want to throw too many names at you, where's the individual who actually owns the bar and serves as bartender? And he said, oh, he's in the back, laying down. He said, is he laying down or dead? He said, oh, no, he's dead. So they shot him, picked him up, took him in the back room, laid him on the cot, and simply went back to drinking and thought no more about it. It's this kind of behavior that gets built into the popular thinking at the time. It feeds into, see where it can go, and this you don't want to see. It feeds into the idea that the cause of all the problem is drinking itself, especially in these coal camps. And they are dangerous places. I cannot convey to you just how dangerous they are. But it's the frontier, and that's the key word. And that's not what people were thinking about at the time. They're simply thinking of the fact that you have all this gunplay, you have this high crime rate, and it's all because of drinking. But it's more than that. It's the frontier setting. It's the absence of vested authority nearby. But it helps, because of what happens in the southern coal fields, it encourages West Virginia to pass a prohibition amendment by 1912. Also, which then helps the passage of the 18th Amendment. Does the passage of the 18th Amendment actually work? Of course, as you know, it does not. It leads to the rise and the increased power of organized crime. It leads to, in particular, both in West Virginia, very early on, and at the national level, a cavalier attitude toward the law. It becomes fashionable to thumb your nose at the law, and that's what this is about. So as my last question to you, does anyone know what a pig's ear is? Very common in West Virginia. This one's a little more sophisticated than most of them, but that's what? Well, it's not a hiding place for you, liquor. Let me take you to Chicago and say a speakeasy. You know what a speakeasy is, right? This is the West Virginia version. Most of these were out in the woods, and so you'd go to a pig's ear to get a drink when alcohol could not be sold or manufactured. And these guys are actually clowning around. But what it tends to represent is that cavalier attitude toward the law itself that gets built into the thinking, that they actually want to get out there and make fun about it. But again, these coal camps were frontier settings. Yeah, the liquor adds to the problem. It supports the passage of a West Virginia Prohibition Amendment and then later the 18th Amendment. But in general, again, keep in mind it was a frontier at the time. I tried to hurry. I know I was about out of time. So thank you. Appreciate it.